Dry Mesa was the kind of place you only found on a map if you were looking for somewhere to disappear. A half-forgotten dip between the Badlands and the high mesas. It baked under a cruel sun by day and shivered beneath bitter winds by night. The year was 1881, though nobody much cared about the turning of the calendar in Dry Mesa. Folks there kept track of time by how long it had been since the last killing or how many wagons passed through without incident. Lately, those numbers weren't good. The town squatted in the dust like a wounded animal, its few buildings leaning in protest against the elements. A single crooked main street stretched from the faded church at one end to the saloon at the other, and in between, homes sat dark and silent behind boarded windows. The sheriff, a man named Harrow, hadn't drawn his gun in months, not because peace reigned, but because Silas Crow and his gang, the Black Vultures, had sunk their claws deep into Dry Mesa, bleeding it slow while the townsfolk turned their eyes away and prayed the trouble would pass them over. That evening, the wind came down from the hills sharp and mean, rattling loose shutters and sending dust devils skittering across the empty street. In the distance, Coyote sang a thin, mournful chorus. The saloon was alive with harsh laughter and the clink of cheap glass, the only sign of life in a town otherwise gone to ground. A lone rider approached from the south, silhouetted against the last glow of a dying sun. His coat, long and faded, bore the stains of old dust and dried blood. The wide brim of his hat shadowed a face weathered by years, lined like cracked leather, and eyes sharp as rifle sights. The horse beneath him was no better off, a rangy bay with ribs showing, one ear nicked, but it carried its burden without complaint. The man's name was Elias Boone, though no one in Dry Mesa knew it. Across the territories, his name passed in whispers, a ghost of old frontier justice and darker deeds. Some said he'd once worn a badge. Others claimed he'd gunned down more men than he could count. Whether outlaw or lawman depended on who was telling the story. Boone rode into town unnoticed, which suited him fine. He tied his horse outside the saloon, though he made no move to enter. Instead, his boots crunched along the street toward the town's only inn, a weary place called the Gallows Rest. But just before reaching the porch steps, something caught his eye in the narrow alley between the general store and a shuttered blacksmith shop. A small shape, hunched and still. Boone slowed, angling his head. In the gloom of the alley, a child lay curled against a stray dog. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, thin as a fence post, hair matted with dust. His clothes hung off him in tatters, and his bare feet were cracked and bloodied from the cold earth. The dog, a lean, mangy mutt with a grizzled muzzle and one cloudy eye, lay with its ribs pressed against the boy's chest, both shivering against the night. No one else spared them a glance. A pair of townsfolk crossed the street with lowered heads, pretending not to notice, eager to stay out of whatever trouble might follow. Boone stood for a moment, silent as stone. The wind tugged at his coat. Then he knelt beside them. The boy stirred, instinctively pulling the dog closer as his eyes blinked open. There was fear there, the kind born from too many hard nights and too many cruel hands. But beneath it, something else too. Hunger. Desperation. Boone reached into his coat, producing a strip of jerky. He held it out. "Easy now," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Ain't looking to hurt you." The boy hesitated, then snatched the meat and wolfed it down, offering a scrap to the dog. Boone uncorked a small canteen and handed it over. The boy drank greedily. "What's your name, son?" Boone asked. "Will," the boy mumbled, barely above a whisper. Boone studied him. "And the mutt?" The boy glanced at the dog, gave a weak shrug. "Dusty. Good a name as any." Boone rose, adjusting the worn leather holster at his hip. His revolver was old, the grip smooth from use, but its steel held a cruel gleam in the low light. Tucked in his coat's inside pocket was a scrap of paper, corners frayed, a wanted poster long since yellowed. The name on it had been burned away, leaving only a smudged likeness of a younger man with the same cold eyes. He reached a hand down. "You'll sleep with me now," Boone said. Will's face tightened, but the hunger won out. He reached for Boone's hand, and Boone hauled him to his feet. Dusty scrambled up as well, tail wagging uncertainly. Together, they crossed the street. Boone kicked open the inn's door, the place silent save for the old desk clerk, who barely looked up. Boone tossed a coin on the counter, and without waiting for a key, led the boy and the dog upstairs. The room was plain, a single bed, a wash basin, and a cracked window pane rattling in the wind. Boone set his rifle by the wall, hung his coat, and dug out another strip of meat for the boy and the dog. Will hesitated near the door. "You stay or go," Boone said. "But you ain't sleepin' in no alley again." The boy edged inside, Dusty at his heel. Boone moved to the window, staring out at the saloon where the flicker of lamps and the raucous howls of the black vultures poured into the night. Shadows moved behind the glass, dark shapes of men with bad hearts and quick tempers. Boone's fingers brushed the butt of his revolver. Another bad place, another night. But maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Dry Mesa had always been a hard place, the kind of town where the sun baked the land until it cracked, and men's tempers cracked right along with it. But it hadn't always been this broken, not until Silas Crow and the black vultures came down from the northern ridges like a storm of locusts. They rode in with dust on their coats and blood on their boots, leaving 3 dead in the street before anyone had time to blink. By the time the sheriff mustered what little nerve he had, it was too late. Silas Crow wasn't the kind of man you crossed. He was lean as a whip, with a face carved from sun-bleached bone and a long, dark coat that never seemed to gather dust. Folks said his eyes were like frostbitten stone, gray, flat, and merciless, the kind that saw a man's worth and weighed against how fast he could draw. His voice was quiet, but when he spoke, even the dogs slunk away. The black vultures, a half-dozen hard-eyed killers who rode with him, weren't much better. Men who didn't blink at taking what wasn't theirs, or leaving a widow weeping over a shallow grave. A few months back, Sheriff Harrow had tried to stand up to them. Word had it a payroll shipment was bound for the garrison at Fort Lamont, passing through Dry Mesa Station at dawn. The sheriff scraped together a handful of deputies, laid in ambush by the grain silos, and waited. When Crow's boys came riding, they came with numbers. The dust settled on 5 bodies, none of them black vultures, and Harrow had been left with a bullet through his leg and enough fear in his belly to keep his badge in a drawer ever since. From that day on, the town belonged to Silas Crow. The saloon became their roost. Every night, the place spilled over with cruel laughter, the barkeep too scared to cut anyone off. Whores and card cheats working under the watchful eye of men who killed for sport. The townsfolk learned to keep their doors bolted and their heads down. A stranger might pass through now and again, but none stayed long. Elias Boone watched it all with a cold, unreadable stare. He took his meals in his room, splitting what little jerky and bread he had with Will and Dusty. The boy's ribs showed under his torn shirt, bruises purple and green blooming across thin arms and a sharp-boned back. Dusty limped from an old bullet crease in his flank. Boone said little, tending to them with a rough gentleness, cleaning wounds with water from a cracked basin and using strips of linen torn from an old shirt. The boy never asked why. Hunger and loneliness made strange bedfellows, and sometimes a stranger's kindness was all you had. On the 3rd night, Will spoke as Boone stitched up a tear in Dusty's ear. "They killed my pa," he said, voice flat but brittle as sun-baked glass. "Shot him clean off the wagon. My ma, too." Boone didn't look up from his work. "Who?" Will's jaw clenched. "Crow. Saw it with my own eyes. Took our mules. Left me and Dusty for the buzzards." Boone's hands paused. The needle still threaded through the dog's ragged skin. The air between them seemed to tighten. "Which road?" Boone asked quietly. "North Trail near Sundown Gulch. 6 months ago, maybe more." The boy looked up then, his face older than his years, dirt clinging to tear tracks etched deep. "I tried to kill him once. Picked up a rock," Will whispered. "One of his men kicked me so hard I couldn't see straight for a week." Boone tied off the stitch. His mouth was a hard line. Somewhere deep in those cold eyes, something old and raw stirred, the kind of rage that didn't burn hot, but settled like coals, steady and slow. "You remember his face good?" "Like the devil's." Boone nodded. "You keep it that way." Later, Boone took a small, bone-handled knife from his saddlebags. It wasn't fancy, Just a narrow-bladed thing with a worn grip. He showed Will how to hold it, how to let it slip through the fingers, and turn with the wrist. They practiced in silence, a bottle perched on the windowsill. The boy's throws clumsy at first, but improving. Dusty watched from the bed. When the saloon's doors banged open and one of Crow's men stumbled out drunk, Boone tensed, his hand brushing the revolver on the nightstand. Will noticed but said nothing. Crow heard about the stranger by the next morning. Word traveled fast in Dry Mesa, especially when it carried a scent of danger. The Black Vultures didn't like strangers much. A quiet rider, asking no questions, keeping to himself. That was a man worth worrying about. Crow sat at a corner table in the saloon, one boot propped on a chair, cleaning his double-barreled Greener shotgun. A long scar ran from his ear to his jaw, pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. He listened as one of his boys described the man. Rough clothes, gray eyes. The way the townsfolk crossed the street to avoid him. Name? Crow asked. Didn't give one. Crow's gaze darkened. Find out. The Black Vultures nodded and slipped away like wolves in tall grass. That evening, Boone left Will and Dusty in the room with a hunk of bread and strict orders. Stay inside, lock the door. No matter what. Will nodded, though Boone saw the stubborn glint in the boy's eye. The kind of look that promised he wouldn't stay put. Boone left anyway. He made his way to the edge of town, past the leaning fence posts and crooked trees, up to a small patch of earth marked by weather-worn stones. Dry Mesa Cemetery was a lonely place, wind scratching over bone-dry grass, the names of the dead fading from cracked wood and stone. Boone knelt by a grave marked Mabel Boone, 1842, 1873. For a long while, he said nothing, just let the wind tug at his coat. Finally, in a voice barely louder than the rustle of dead leaves, he spoke. I told you I was done with this. Told myself too. He touched the stone, tracing the name with a scarred finger. But it's never done, is it? Memories flooded back, the firelight, the scream, the pistol blast in the dark. Another town, another gang, another grave too shallow. When Boone rose, the resolve in him was old and familiar. He knew what needed doing. Back at the inn, Will waited only until Boone's boots faded down the stairs before he slipped out the window, Dusty scrambling after. The boy's hand closed around the bone-handled knife, and in the shadows of Dry Mesa, a plan began to form. The night hung heavy over Devil's Spine Pass, the stars scattered cold and sharp above the jagged walls of rock. The narrow canyon twisted like a gnarled scar through the hills, with sheer cliffs rising on either side, leaving only a single wagon-wide path below. Men called it Devil's Spine for good reason. It had claimed more than its share of lives, from careless travelers to waylaid caravans. Tonight, it was waiting to claim a few more. Elias Boone moved like a shadow along the upper ridge, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, his rifle strapped to his back. The canyon floor lay far below, ghostly in the pale moonlight. He stopped at a cluster of boulders balanced precariously on a ledge and wedged a pry bar beneath them. A good shove would be all it took to send the rocks crashing down on anything unfortunate enough to pass beneath. He worked in silence, his breath misting in the cold. Every so often, he'd scan the ridgeline, sharp eyes watching for movement. He knew the terrain, every rise and hollow, and how to use them. There was a time he'd made a name doing just that. Years ago, before the lines on his face and the ghosts in his chest, Elias had worn a badge. Folks spoke his name in towns from Laramie to Deadwood. The man who rode alone into outlaw camps and rode out with no one left standing. Some said he was touched by death itself, that no bullet could find him, though Elias knew better. Death found everyone eventually. Back then, he'd had a deputy, a sharp-eyed kid named Silas Crow, quick on the draw and hungry for glory. Elias had taken him in, taught him to shoot, track, and read a man's soul through his eyes. He remembered thinking Crow might be the one to carry on when his own bones gave out. That was before greed sunk its teeth into the boy and turned him. Elias gritted his teeth and jammed a wedge beneath the last boulder. The stage would come at dawn, carrying a fat military payroll meant for Fort Lamont. Crow's vultures would be waiting, salivating at the thought of it. Only this time, someone was waiting for them, high on the ridge opposite. A small figure crouched among the rocks, eyes wide and breath held. Will had followed Boone from town, Dusty padding silent at his side. He knew he wasn't supposed to be there. Boone's warning had been clear, but the boy's heart wouldn't let him sit idle. He owed his father, his mother, and something deep in his bones told him this night mattered. Down in the canyon, dawn's first light brushed the horizon, painting the rock faces in blood-colored streaks. The creak of leather and clink of iron echoed as the stagecoach rounded the bend, flanked by 4 mounted soldiers. Dust rose in its wake, wheels grinding over stone. In the shadows, the black vultures waited. Crow stood among them, his dark coat catching the wind. His face was as Elias remembered, lean, cruel, with that old scar pulling his mouth into a sneer. His shotgun rested easy in his hands. The others crouched with rifles and pistols, eyes fixed on the approaching coach. At a sharp whistle, the ambush sprang. Gunfire cracked like lightning, and the canyon roared with shouts. One soldier toppled from his saddle, a bullet catching him in the throat. Another took a round to the chest and folded without a sound. The coach's driver scrambled for cover as lead chewed splinters from the wagon. Elias moved. From his perch, he raised the old Winchester and picked his targets. One shot, a vulture dropped with a hole where his eye had been. Another tried to flank the coach, but Elias' bullet found his heart. The sound of the rifle's report was swallowed by the chaos, but Crow's sharp instincts felt the shift. His head snapped toward the ridge. "Up top," he shouted. 2 of his men scrambled for cover, but Elias had already vanished deeper into the rocks. He moved like a ghost, boots silent, rifle steady. Every shot counted. Every shot mattered. Will watched from his hiding place, his chest tight, fingers clenching the bone-handled knife Boone had given him. Dusty whined low in his throat, but Will hushed him. Below, the soldiers fought back. One manned the coach's shotgun, blasting a vulture clean off his feet. But they were outnumbered, and one by one, they fell. Crow advanced on the stage, his shotgun raised. He waved a hand, and 2 of his men dragged the heavy lockbox from inside. "Crack it," Crow barked, a cruel grin twisting his face. He never saw Boone step from the shadows behind him. "Drop it, Silas." The voice was like a knife edge, cutting through the noise. Crow spun, eyes narrowing. "Well, hell," he drawled. "Knew it smelled like death out here." Elias leveled his rifle. "Long time, boy." Crow's grin didn't falter. "Ain't no badge on you now, old man." "Don't need one." A tense silence fell, the other outlaws pausing at the sight of their leader, caught in the open. Crow shifted his stance, reading the angles. "You should have stayed buried, Boone. Ain't room in this world for your kind anymore. There's always room for one more grave." Crow's hand twitched, but Elias fired first. The bullet struck Crow in the side, spinning him half around. He grunted, staggered, but didn't fall. That's when Will made his mistake. The boy, desperate to help, darted from cover, knife in hand. Dusty barked a sharp, panicked sound. Crow's eyes locked on him. Faster than any wounded man had a right to move. He grabbed Will, yanking the boy in front of him, the shotgun's muzzle digging into the child's temple. "Drop it, Boone." Crow snarled. Elias froze, teeth clenched. He met Will's wide, terrified gaze. Behind them, the surviving vultures closed in. "You ain't got the stomach for this." Crow sneered. Will's hand trembled. Then his fingers tightened around the knife, just like Boone had shown him. A flick of the wrist. The blade buried itself in Crow's thigh. The outlaw howled, his grip loosening. Elias moved in that same instant, a second shot blasting Crow's chest open. The man staggered, blood blooming dark against his coat. He looked down at the wound, then up at Elias, a flicker of something almost like relief crossing his face. "Should have killed me back then," Crow rasped. "Did now." Crow's knees buckled, and he toppled. The canyon fell silent, save for the echo of the shot. The remaining outlaws scattered, fear gutting their resolve. Elias didn't bother to chase them. He holstered his gun and knelt by Will, pulling the boy close. "You hurt?" Will shook his head, lip trembling. "Got him." "Yeah, you did." Together, they gathered the payroll lockbox and checked the fallen soldiers. One clung to life, a young corporal, and Boone patched his wounds best he could. By the time the sun climbed over the ridge, Devil's Spine Pass was empty but for the dead and those who'd survived by grit and chance. Elias stood at the canyon's mouth, the boy and the dog beside him, and watched the wind carry the dust of battle away. The rising sun poured molten gold across Dry Mesa, streaking the crooked rooftops and casting long shadows over the dust-choked street. It was the kind of dawn that made men hold their breath, as if something sacred had slipped between the hours of night and day. The town had always greeted morning with wary eyes, but this time it was different. Elias Boone rode in slow, the brim of his hat low over his eyes, blood-smeared and weary, his rifle strapped across his saddle. Will sat behind him, arms tight around the old man's waist, and Dusty limped along at the horse's flank. The boy's clothes were torn and his face smudged with soot, but his eyes were sharp, carrying a light that hadn't been there before. The town stirred as they passed, curtains twitched, doors creaked open, and wary faces peered out. A pair of old-timers, leaned on a hitching post outside the mercantile, watched them approach. One spat into the dirt. The other murmured, "Is that who I think it is?" Word traveled fast. By the time Elias reached the center of town, Sheriff Harrow stood waiting on the porch of his office, leaning heavily on a cane, a deep scar across his leg, still mending from the last time he'd tried to stand against the black vultures. His badge glinted in the fresh light, though it hadn't seen proper use in months. "Well, I'll be damned," Harrow muttered as Boone dismounted. "Crow's dead," Elias said, voice rough as sandpaper. His men scattered. Harrow looked him over, then his eyes dropped to the boy and the dog. Will straightened under the scrutiny, chin up, though his hand still trembled. "You did what I couldn't," Harrow admitted, his words tight with a mix of gratitude and shame. "I owe you for that. Town does." Elias gave a curt nod. No words wasted, but before any man could speak further, a fresh figure appeared from the east, dust rising from the trail behind him. A tall rider in a long, dark coat with a silver star gleaming at his chest. U.S. Marshal's badge. He rode with the easy air of a man who'd seen death often enough not to flinch at its company. The marshal dismounted and strode up, tugging the gloves from his hands. Weathered face, steel-gray hair at his temples, and eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Name's Josiah Kane," he said. "Been tracking rumors of a payroll ambush near these parts. Came to collect what's left and find the man behind it." Elias met his gaze. "Stage is safe. Soldiers we buried proper. Lockboxes with me." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "That's so." He studied Elias carefully, then reached into his coat and pulled free a tattered, yellowed wanted poster. The face was younger, less lined, but the eyes were the same. "I'll be," the marshal murmured. "Elias Boone." The name rippled through the watching townsfolk, like a stone tossed into still water. "You were a lawman once," Kane said, voice quieter now. Then turned ghost. "Half the territories heard stories. Didn't figure I'd find you out here." Elias didn't blink. Didn't plan on being found. Planned on killing Crow, though. Elias gave a slight nod. Marshal Kane held up the poster. "There's a bounty on this face. Murder. Vigilantism. Desertion. Didn't start out that way," Elias said, his voice carrying in the hush that had fallen over Dry Mesa. "Wore a badge. Kept peace from Dakota Territory to Pecos River. Crow rode with me once. Trusted him like a brother." He paused, his gaze darkening, "till a gang come through our camp one night. Killed my wife. My little girl. Crow was supposed to be watching the ridge. Took his cut from him instead." A murmur ran through the crowd. Will stepped forward, his fists balled at his sides. "He saved me," the boy said fiercely. "He saved this whole town. Crow would have gutted us all. Sheriff tried, couldn't do it. Boone did." Marshal Kane looked down at the boy, the defiance blazing in his dirt-smudged face. A few others nodded, the blacksmith's wife, an old rancher missing 3 fingers, the barkeep who'd poured drinks for the vultures under threat of a loaded pistol. "I was gonna leave after," Elias admitted, voice low. "Had no intention of lingering where ghosts find me easy. But I reckon this boy, and maybe this place, deserves better than that." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Dusty wagged his tail once and pressed against Will's side. Marshal Kane studied the gathered faces, then looked again at Elias, at the wear on the man's clothes, the hollow in his eyes, the hand scarred from too many fights. A man too tired to run, too stubborn to die. Finally, Kane sighed. He took the wanted poster in both hands, and with a slow, deliberate motion, tore it clean in half. "Wasn't no official record left on you," he said. "Poster was all I had, and now it's kindling. Reckon you earned that much." The crowd exhaled as one. "But I'll ask you this, Boone, what now?" Elias looked down at Will. The boy's eyes held steady under his, waiting. "I'll stay," Boone said at last, voice rough. "On one condition." "What's that?" "I don't take a badge. Not yet. I'll see this place stand a while. See the boy's got a roof and some decent boots. If the law needs me, you'll know where to find me." Marshal Kane gave a faint smile. "Fair enough." Sheriff Harrow limped down the steps, gritting his teeth as he moved. "Place could do worse than a man like you," he muttered, offering a hand. "Better you than me." Elias shook it, the grip firm. Will grinned for the first time in days. "You'll need a deputy, too." Will piped up. Boone arched a brow. "That's so." Will nodded. "I know how to throw a knife." The crowd chuckled softly, the weight in the air easing. "Then you better learn to shoot," Boone said, ruffling the boy's hair. Dusty barked once, the sun climbing higher as Dry Mesa began to come alive again. Doors opened, curtains lifted, and for the first time in months, the town felt less like a graveyard and more like a place where a man might stake a future. Elias Boone watched it all in silence, the ghosts of his past still clinging at his back, but the warmth of a boy's hand in his own pulling him steady toward what might just be a better road. Dry Mesa changed after that long night at Devil's Spine Pass. Not all at once, not like the turning of a season, but slowly, like the thaw of hard ground after a bitter winter. The weight that had hung over the town for so long, the fear, the silence, the bitter knowing that death rode in every dusk wind, began to lift. It started with the saloon, where once the black vultures had held court. Now the laughter was lighter, the drink poured easier. The barkeep, a gray-bearded man named Harmon, cleaned the bloodstains off the floor and kept a shotgun beneath the counter, just in case. The church bell rang again on Sundays, and folks began to meet each other's eyes in the street. The blacksmith fired his forge with pride. The general store kept its shelves stocked, and trade wagons began to roll through without the stifling dread of a gun barrel behind every shadow. Elias Boone didn't ask for thanks. He didn't take a badge, either, though folks called him Marshal Boone soon enough, whether he claimed the title or not. He took to walking the length of town each morning, rifle slung across his back, Dusty padding along at his side with a limp that never fully healed. On the porch of the sheriff's office, the old dog would settle, head resting on his paws, watching the comings and goings as if he alone kept the peace. And Will, the boy no one had claimed, the boy left to starve in an alley with a stray dog for warmth, became Elias Boone's shadow. At first it was chores, fetching water, mucking out the stables, running messages between homesteads. But Boone knew the value of a sharp eye and a steady hand, and so he taught the boy how to track a man through dust and brush, how to read the way birds scattered a shot, how to tell the weight of a horse's hoof-print by its depth in the dirt. He showed him how to fire a rifle, and when Will's hand steadied, how to draw a revolver fast and sure. The boy practiced until his fingers blistered, until he could split a pine not at 30 paces. Elias taught him other things too, lessons carried from 100 camps and lonely trails. How men lie with their eyes before their mouths. How justice can be a heavy thing, and sometimes the weight is yours alone to carry. How death comes for every man, but it matters the road you walk to meet it. In the cool of the evenings, they'd sit by the fire behind the sheriff's office, Boone whittling thin shavings from a length of wood, while listening as the old man spoke of the days before, of lawless towns, cattle wars, railroad men who bought lead with their gold, of friends lost and debts still unpaid. Time, as it does, slipped by. New settlers came, raising homesteads beyond the edge of town. Dry Mesa streets, once so empty, filled with wagons and horses, with women hanging laundry in the sun and children racing through the alleys. The town built a schoolhouse. A stage line made regular stops, and trade routes began to stretch further. No outlaw gangs came through. Word spread quick that Dry Mesa wasn't worth the trouble. A man named Boone watched over it, and his name carried weight heavier than iron. Will grew tall. His boyish face hardened into sharp lines and storm-gray eyes that matched his mentor's. His hand never strayed far from the bone-handled knife he still carried, nor the iron at his hip. He earned his keep, taking to patrols on his own, settling disputes between ranchers, hunting down a horse thief or two. Folks began to look to him as they did Boone, and though Elias never said it outright, there was a look in his eyes, a quiet pride that spoke of things he'd once thought lost. The boy had become a man, shaped not by the weight of tragedy, but by the resolve to outrun its shadow. The seasons rolled on. Dusty, ever faithful, grew slower, his muzzle widening, his limp more pronounced. But he stayed, the old dog of Dry Mesa, sunning himself on the porch, growling soft at any stranger who looked like he might be trouble. Then, one spring morning, Elias Boone was gone. No warning, no note, no grave. Some said he rode out into the hills to meet his ghosts. Others believed death finally found him, as it does every man. Will searched the canyons for days, found nothing but the sound of wind through stone. In the end, he returned to town, the bone-handled knife at his belt and the lessons Boone left in his blood. Years passed, and so it came to be. One evening, in a town 2 territories east, a stranger rode in. The saloon doors swung wide, conversation faltering. The man was tall, his face weathered by trail dust and sun, a revolver worn smooth by use. At his side hung a knife with a bone grip, and at his feet trailed a brindle dog, old but steady. The barkeep eyed the stranger as he ordered a drink, and an old ranch hand at the bar leaned in to whisper, "Who's that?" The barkeep didn't answer right away. He studied the man, the way he moved, the cut of his coat, the weight he carried. "They say his name's Will Boone," he murmured. "Comes from a town called Dry Mesa. Man taught by Elias himself." The name moved through the room, in hushed tones, like a ripple over still water. Not a man there didn't know the stories, of Devil's Spine Pass, of the Black Vultures, of a ghost in a long coat, who made bad men vanish. And so it was that, in a land where shadows ruled, one man, one orphan, and a loyal mud lit a fire that still burns in the tales of the frontier.